Most people think inheritance is a silver spoon, a clean check handed over a mahogany table. They're wrong. Inheritance is usually just someone else's mess left for you to clean up. For Maeve, it was a rotting cabin in the Oregon woods, a final insult from a family that erased her for 22 years. The rest of them took the millions. They left her the mold. But they didn't know what was built into the walls. They didn't know about the $18 million. The probate lawyer's office smelled like lemon pledge and stale coffee. It was the smell of money trying to mask the scent of death. Maeve sat in a leather chair that swallowed her whole, staring at a man whose hourly rate was more than her monthly rent. His name was William Finch, and he looked at her with the bored, glassy expression of a man who had delivered bad news 1,000 times and learned to feel nothing. 22 years, Finch said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look at her. He looked at the manila folder on his desk. That is how long the estate of Desmond Cole has been locked in litigation. It is, to my knowledge, a county record. Maeve didn't laugh. She just stared at the folder. She was 12 when her Uncle Desmond died. She was 34 now. In the space between those two numbers, her mother had died of pancreatic cancer in a sterile county hospital, entirely broke, waiting for a piece of the Cole fortune that never materialized. The family, Desmond's legitimate heirs, the cousins, the half-siblings, had lawyered up and fought like starving dogs over every stock portfolio, every commercial property, every antique silver spoon. They had frozen the assets. They had buried each other in injunctions, and they had entirely forgotten about Maeve. So it's finally settled, Maeve said. Her voice was flat. She had taken a half-day off from her job, managing a dental clinic in Portland, to be here. She was losing $60 in wages just to sit in this chair. It is, Finch replied. He finally looked up. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not pity, maybe mild amusement. Your cousins Pierce and Caroline reached a settlement yesterday morning. The liquid assets, the real estate in Seattle, the holdings in the Cayman Islands, all distributed. Good for them, Maeve said, shifting in the leather chair. The silence in the room stretched. Traffic hummed 20 stories below. Why am I here, Mr. Finch? If they took it all, why did you call me? Finch opened the folder. He slid a single piece of heavy stock paper across the polished mahogany. It was a deed. Desmond's will was a complicated document, Finch said, his voice dropping into a practiced, legal cadence. He was a paranoid man. He left specific instructions that a certain piece of property was not to be included in the primary trust. It was to be left to you. But because of the overarching injunctions filed by Pierce and Caroline, we couldn't disburse this single asset until the entire estate was settled. Maeve looked at the paper. It wasn't a check. A cabin, Finch said, anticipating her question. 70 acres of unarable, steeply graded land in the Cascade Mountains. No modern utilities. The structure was built in the early 70s. According to the county assessor, the property is essentially worthless, save for the timber, which is heavily restricted by environmental protections. Maeve felt a hot, sharp twist in her gut. Not disappointment. Disappointment requires hope. It was a familiar, cynical rage. A worthless cabin. For 22 years my mother and I were locked out of millions, and he left me a shack in the woods. I am legally obligated to hand you these keys, Finch said, pushing a small manila envelope across the desk. It clinked heavily. The property taxes have been paid by an escrow account that is now empty. You are the sole owner of record, Miss Cole. You owe back taxes starting next January. I advise you to sell it for whatever the land is worth and be done with it. Maeve picked up the envelope. The keys inside felt heavy, sharp, and rusted. Did Pierce and Caroline know about this? She asked. Finch offered a thin, bloodless smile. They sent an appraiser out there 10 years ago. When they heard it was a dilapidated shack with a collapsed roof on unsellable land, they chose not to contest your claim to it. They let you have it. They let me have it. Maeve stood up. She didn't shake Finch's hand. She walked out of the air-conditioned office, took the elevator down to the sweltering July pavement, and got into her 10-year-old Honda. She tossed the envelope onto the passenger seat. It sat there, a silent, mocking reminder of a family that had viewed her as nothing more than a clerical error to be swept under the rug. She wasn't going to keep it. She couldn't afford a second property, let alone pay taxes on a rotting monument to her uncle's eccentricity. She would drive up there this weekend, take a few pictures, list it with the cheapest broker she could find, and use the money to pay off her credit cards. That was the plan, clean, simple, and cynical. The drive into the Cascades was brutal. The pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a deeply rutted logging road that threatened to tear the oil pan right out of Maeve's car. It was raining, not a downpour, but a relentless, misty drizzle that clung to the windshield and turned the dirt road into slick, gray grease. The towering Douglas firs blocked out the midday sun, casting the world in a bruised twilight blue. Maeve drove in silence. The radio had lost its signal an hour ago. She gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, calculating the cost of a blown tire against her checking account balance. Just get there, she told herself. Take the photos, leave. Her GPS died a mile from the coordinates. She had to rely on a printed map Finch had provided, squinting at overgrown trail markers. Finally, the trees broke, revealing a small, choked clearing. Maeve parked the car and killed the engine. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. She stepped out into the damp chill. There it was. Her inheritance. It was worse than Finch had described. The cabin was a single-story structure made of rough-hewn logs that had turned black with rot and moss. The roof sagged violently in the middle, resembling a broken spine. A blue plastic tarp, faded and shredded by years of wind, clung desperately to the chimney. The front porch was a treacherous jumble of splintered boards. Perfect, Maeve muttered, zipping her jacket up to her chin. A real palace. She walked carefully up to the front door. The padlock was rusted solid. She didn't even bother with the keys from the envelope. She went back to her trunk, grabbed a heavy iron tire iron, and brought it down on the padlock with a sharp, angry crack. The brittle metal snapped on the second hit. She pushed the door open. The hinges screamed in protest. The smell hit her first. It was the thick, powdery stench of dead mice, mildew, and stale ash. She pulled a flashlight from her pocket and clicked it on. The interior was a graveyard of a paranoid life. Desmond Cole had been a billionaire, but he had lived in this room like a doomsday prepper. There were stacks of water-damaged cardboard boxes, a rusted iron bed frame with a mattress that had been entirely eviscerated by rodents, and shelves lined with bloated, expired canned goods. Maeve stepped inside, her boots crunching on broken glass and animal droppings. The air was cold, colder than outside. She started walking through the small space, taking mental inventory. Trash, trash, biohazard, trash. Nothing here was worth selling. The furniture was garbage. The structure was a teardown. Whoever bought this land would have to pay thousands just to bulldoze this monstrosity. Her dream of paying off her credit cards was evaporating into the damp air. She walked toward the back of the single room. A massive cast-iron wood stove dominated the wall. It was an ugly, brutalist thing, matte black and covered in a thick layer of dust and spider webs. Beside it, a stack of rotting firewood sat in a heavy metal cradle. Maeve shivered. The damp was seeping into her bones. She needed to take her photos and get out before the light failed completely. She pulled out her phone, turned on the flash, and started snapping pictures of the corners, the ceiling, the damage. As she moved around the stove to get a shot of the back wall, she kicked something. Clank. It was a dull, heavy sound, not the hollow ring of a tin can. It sounded like she had just kicked a solid piece of anvil. She pointed her flashlight down. It was a doorstop, or rather it was serving as one. It was a rectangular brick, painted the same matte black as the wood stove, wedged against the bottom of an old wooden wardrobe to keep it from tipping forward on the uneven floor. Maeve rubbed her toe through her boot. It throbbed. She reached down to move the brick out of the way. She gripped it and pulled. It didn't move. Maeve frowned. She braced herself, gripped the brick with both hands and heaved. It lifted off the floor, but the sheer, concentrated weight of it nearly tore her shoulders from their sockets. She dropped it immediately. Thud. The floorboards groaned. Maeve stared at the black brick. It was the size of a standard paperback book. Maybe 2 inches thick, 4 inches wide, 8 inches long. A regular clay brick that size weighed about 4 or 5 pounds. A piece of iron that size weighed maybe 15. This thing weighed at least 30 pounds. She crouched down, the cold and the smell of the cabin entirely forgotten. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a strange, creeping rhythm in her chest. She reached out and traced the surface of the brick with her thumb. The black paint was thick, slapped on carelessly. It felt slightly textured, masking whatever was underneath. Maeve stood up, went to the rusted toolbox sitting on the counter, and rummaged through the debris until she found a flathead screwdriver. She walked back to the heavy black brick. She knelt down on the filthy floor. She pressed the edge of the screwdriver into the black paint and scraped hard. The paint flaked away, revealing a dull gray surface. Lead. Maeve exhaled, feeling a sudden rush of foolishness. Of course, it was lead. Desmond probably used it for casting bullets or something. She was letting her imagination run wild. She scraped harder, putting her weight into it, digging deeper through the layers of grime and gray primer. Suddenly, the screwdriver slipped. It gouged deeply into the metal beneath the paint. Maeve froze. She brought the flashlight closer, shining the beam directly onto the fresh scratch. The metal beneath wasn't gray. It wasn't silver. It was a deep, lustrous, impossible yellow. Maeve stopped breathing. The silence of the cabin pressed in on her, broken only by the frantic pounding of her own pulse in her ears. She dropped the screwdriver. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the flashlight steady. She rubbed her thumb over the yellow scratch. It didn't smear. It didn't fade. It caught the harsh LED light and threw it back with a warm, heavy glow. Gold. Solid. Cast gold. No, Maeve whispered. The word sounded small and terrified in the empty room. No, that's not. That's insane. She grabbed the screwdriver again and began hacking frantically at the black paint, no longer caring about scratching the surface. She chipped away large flakes, revealing more and more of the yellow metal. Within 2 minutes, half the brick was exposed. It was undeniable. It lacked the stamps and serial numbers of a bank-issued bullion bar. It had been crudely smelted, poured into a rough mold, and painted to look like a piece of industrial scrap. But the weight, the softness of the metal, the color, it was gold. Maeve sat back on her heels, her mind spinning wildly out of control. A gold bar of this size, roughly 400 troy ounces, was worth. She scrambled to do the math in her head, trying to remember the current spot price. $2,000 an ounce, more, $800,000. For a doorstop, a wave of nausea washed over her. She gripped her knees, forcing herself to take deep, shaky breaths. Desmond Cole didn't leave you a cabin, a voice in her head whispered. He left you a bank vault. If this was a doorstop, what else was here? She scrambled to her feet, moving with frantic, erratic energy. She pointed her flashlight at the massive wood stove. She rushed over to it and placed her hands on the heavy black metal. It felt cold and rough. She began tapping the sides with the handle of the screwdriver. Clink, clink, clink. It sounded like iron. She opened the heavy iron door of the stove. It was filled with old ash, but beneath the ash, lining the bottom of the firebox, were more bricks. 10 of them. Maeve reached in, ignoring the soot coating her hands and jacket. She grabbed one of the bricks. It was identical in size to the doorstop, identical in its staggering, unnatural weight. She hauled it out, dropped it on the floor, and scraped it. Gold. She hauled out another, scraped it. Gold. There were 10 bars in the stove. 10 bars times 800,000, $8 million, hidden in plain sight, painted with high-heat black enamel, holding up burning logs. Maeve started laughing. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a jagged, hysterical sound that bordered on a sob. For 22 years, Pierce and Caroline had paid an army of lawyers millions of dollars in billable hours to secure their trust funds. They had fought over paper. They had fought over digital numbers on bank screens. And Desmond, that vicious, paranoid old bastard, had quietly liquidated a massive portion of his hidden wealth, turned it into untraceable metal, painted it black, and tossed it into a rotting cabin that he specifically willed to the one relative everyone else hated. He didn't just hide the money. He weaponized it. He knew the legal battles would rage. He knew the legitimate heirs would ignore the worthless real estate. It was a 22-year delayed middle finger from beyond the grave. Maeve leaned against the filthy wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor amidst the rat droppings and gold. What do I do? The initial euphoria vanished, replaced instantly by a cold, suffocating paranoia. She looked at the door she had just broken open with a tire iron. It hung slightly off its hinges, a gaping black hole leading out into the darkening woods. She was miles from the nearest paved road. She had no cell service, and she was sitting on 10, 11, maybe more bars of solid gold. If anyone found out, if Pierce or Caroline found a discrepancy in the old financial records, if they sent someone up here to check on the property they had so generously let her have. They had infinite resources. They would drag her into court. They would claim the gold belonged to the primary estate, that it was hidden assets, that Desmond wasn't of sound mind. They would bleed her dry in legal fees until she was forced to surrender it just to survive. No, Maeve thought, her jaw tightening. A fierce, primal protectiveness flared in her chest. You let my mother die in a public ward. You left me with nothing. This is mine. She forced herself to stand. She needed to be systematic. She needed to know exactly what she was dealing with. She grabbed the flashlight and began tearing the cabin apart. She moved with manic strength, adrenaline fueling her muscles. She checked every heavy object, the counterweights on the old sash windows, painted gold bars slightly thinner, slotted into the frames, 4 of them. She tore the rotting mattress off the iron bed frame. The frame itself was steel, but the hollow pipes acting as the posts felt unnaturally solid. She found a hacksaw in the toolbox and sawed through one of the legs. The blade bit through the thin steel, hitting something soft and dense inside. She angled the flashlight. The hollow steel legs were packed tight with minted gold coins, stacked like sleeves of casino chips. Krugerrands, eagles, maple leafs, thousands of them. By the time the sun had completely set, plunging the woods into pitch blackness, Maeve sat exhausted in the center of the room. She had built a small fire in the stove, carefully placing the burning wood on a piece of sheet metal to avoid damaging the fortune beneath it. The flickering orange light danced across the room. She had made piles, 11 of the massive crude cast bars. 4 window weights, 4 bedpost pipes, crammed full of coins. She had found a small, leather-bound notebook wedged inside a false bottom of the toolbox. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. Written in Desmond's erratic scrawl, it detailed a slow, methodical process that took place between 1998 and 2003. Fake invoices, shell companies buying scrap metal, a quiet private smelter in Nevada. The final page had a single number circled in red ink, dated a month before his death. 18,400,000. Beneath it, a single sentence was written. Let them fight over the scraps. Keep the foundation. Maeve stared at the notebook. She rubbed her soot-stained face. She was exhausted, filthy, and entirely alone in the dark. She had $18 million sitting on the floor. It weighed over 800 pounds. She couldn't carry it out. She couldn't call a bank. She couldn't call a truck. She walked over to the broken front door. She pulled it shut, the warped wood scraping loudly against the frame. She found an old 2x4 in the corner and wedged it under the door handle, barricading herself inside. She sat back down by the fire, her eyes fixed on the dull, painted metal that represented her entire future. She didn't know how she was going to get it out. She didn't know how she was going to launder it, sell it, or explain it without ending up in federal prison or tied up in a decade of lawsuits. But as she listened to the rain, hammering against the sagging roof, for the first time in 22 years, Maeve wasn't afraid of the future. She pulled the black doorstop toward her, resting her boots against the $1 million brick. She had a lot of work to do. Morning broke not with sunlight, but with a flat, gray dilution of the darkness. Maeve woke up shivering on the hard floorboards, her spine completely locked. The fire in the brutalist stove had died hours ago, leaving the cabin smelling of cold ash and wet rot. For 5 seconds she was just a tired woman with a terrible stiff neck in a ruined shack. Then she opened her eyes and saw the black brick sitting exactly where she had left it. She crawled toward it. She placed her palm flat against the cold metal. It was real. The immediate rush of adrenaline was quickly suffocated by a crushing wave of logistical dread. How do you move 800 pounds of solid gold? Her Honda Civic had a maximum payload capacity of maybe 850 pounds. If she loaded the bricks, the window weights, and the coin-stuffed bedposts into the trunk, the car would ride practically on the axles. One deep pothole on that washed-out logging road, one sharp rock against the undercarriage, and she would tear the oil pan right out of the engine. She would be stranded in the deep woods with $18 million in stolen-looking bullion. She couldn't stay. She couldn't take it with her. Maeve stood up, her joints popping. She found a piece of charred wood in the stove and violently rubbed the soot over the deep yellow gouges she had scratched into the doorstop and the stove bricks. It wasn't perfect, but in the dim light, it masked the gold. She shoved the doorstop back against the wardrobe. She threw the ruined, rat-eaten mattress back over the sawed-off bedpost. She walked out the front door, pulling it shut and wedging a heavy rock against it. She didn't look back. She got into her car, turned the heater on full blast, and drove the 3 hours back to Portland in complete, terrified silence. For the next 4 days, Maeve lived a double life. At the dental clinic, she smiled at patients, scheduled root canals, and argued with insurance providers over copays. Beneath her desk, her legs bounced with kinetic, unspent energy. She was practically vibrating. At night, she sat at her kitchen table in her cramped apartment, a legal pad filled with frantic, scribbled math. She needed a truck. She had $1,200 in her checking account and $4,000 in credit card debt. On Wednesday night, she applied for a predatory personal loan online. She claimed it was for emergency medical expenses. The algorithm approved her for $15,000 at a staggering 19% interest rate. The money hit her account on Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon, she was standing in the gravel lot of a sketchy used car dealership on 82nd Avenue. She handed over $12,000 in a cashier's check for a 2006 Ford F-250. The truck was severely dented, smelled faintly of wet dog and stale cigarettes, and had 250,000 miles on the odometer, but it had heavy-duty leaf springs and a pristine engine block. She spent another $500 at a hardware store. Heavy-duty plastic storage totes, industrial moving blankets, a steel hand truck, a pair of thick leather work gloves, a crowbar. On Saturday morning, at 4 a.m., she drove back into the Cascades. The rain had returned harder this time. The logging road was a river of slick, brown grease. The heavy truck fishtailed twice, the rear tires spinning furiously in the mud before catching purchase. Maeve gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles entirely white, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. When she reached the clearing, the cabin looked exactly as she had left it. A rotting, forgotten tomb. She backed the truck up as close to the front porch as she dared, the massive tires tearing deep ruts into the soft earth. She dropped the tailgate. The extraction took 6 hours. It was the hardest physical labor of her life. The hand truck proved useless. The tires immediately sank into the saturated mud between the porch and the truck. She had to carry everything by hand. She started with the stove bricks. 30 pounds doesn't sound like much until you have to carry it 50 feet through deep mud, lift it over a tailgate, and do it again, and again, and again. By the 5th brick, her forearms were burning. By the 8th, her lower back was a tight, screaming knot of pain. The heavy canvas of her jacket was soaked through, sticking to her freezing skin. Rainwater mixed with the sweat, stinging her eyes. "Keep the foundation," she muttered to herself, echoing Desmond's ledger. She grabbed another black brick, her breath coming in ragged white plumes in the freezing air. Let them fight over the scraps. She moved the window weights. She used the crowbar to pry the remaining 3 steel bedposts from the frame, duct taping the ends shut so the coins wouldn't spill out. Every time she dropped a piece of disguised gold into the plastic totes in the truck bed, the suspension groaned, settling lower and lower. Finally, it was done. The cabin was stripped. Maeve stood in the doorway one last time. The brutalist stove was empty. The windows were missing their counterweights, the glass rattling violently in the wind. It was just a hollow, worthless wooden shell, exactly what Pierce and Caroline thought it was. She didn't lock the door. Let the scavengers have it. She drove the truck back to Portland, the payload pinning the rear tires firmly to the asphalt. She didn't go to her apartment. She drove to a sprawling, cinder-block self-storage facility in a bleak industrial park near the airport. She had rented a climate-controlled interior unit the day before under a newly formed LLC. She unloaded the totes onto a flatbed cart, wheeled them down the fluorescent-lit concrete hallway, and stacked them in the corner of the small, featureless metal room. She locked the roll-up door with 3 separate, heavy-duty disc padlocks. She walked back out to the truck. She sat on the driver's seat, the engine off. It was over. She had the gold. Maeve rested her forehead against the steering wheel, and finally, for the first time since she was 12 years old, she began to cry. She wept until her ribs ached, the sound muffled by the rain drumming against the windshield. It wasn't a release of joy. It was grief, pure, unadulterated grief for her mother, who had died worrying about how to pay the electric bill, while millions of dollars sat rusting in a forest just 3 hours away. Having $18 million in crude gold is not the same as having $18 million. In the eyes of the law, Maeve was still a dental clinic manager, making $55,000 a year. If she suddenly paid off a mortgage in cash or bought a luxury car, the IRS would flag her within a month. She had to wash it, and she had to be patient. She started with the coins. They were the easiest. Krugerrands and American Eagles were a recognized currency in the gray market. She took a week of vacation time. She packed a small canvas duffel bag with 30 coins and drove north. She stopped at a dusty pawn shop in Olympia, a coin dealer in Tacoma, and a rare metals broker in Seattle. She played her part perfectly, the naive, slightly grieving niece. "I found these in my grandfather's attic," she told a balding man behind thick, bulletproof glass in Olympia, sliding 5 gold eagles across the counter. "I don't know much about them. I just need to pay off some student loans." The man scrutinized the coins under a jeweler's loupe, checked the spot price on his monitor, and offered her a price 10% below market value. Maeve accepted it with a grateful smile. He handed her $9,000 in $100 bills. No paperwork was required for transactions under $10,000. She repeated the performance over and over. By the end of the week, her fingers smelled permanently of brass and old paper, and she had $85,000 in a fireproof lockbox under her bed. It was enough to breathe. She walked into the dental clinic on a Tuesday morning. She didn't cause a scene. She didn't tell her boss off. She simply handed in a 2-week notice typed on plain white paper. When the clinic owner asked why, she smiled thinly. "I inherited a little bit of money," she said. "I'm going to take some time to figure things out." The real challenge was the black bricks. She couldn't take a crudely smelted 30-pound block of unmarked gold to a pawn shop. They would think she robbed a cartel. She needed a professional. She spent weeks on encrypted forums, navigating the paranoid, hyper-libertarian world of off-grid wealth preservation. But she eventually found a name. A private metallurgist and assayer operating out of an industrial sector in Nevada. A man named Harris. She loaded 4 of the black bricks into the floorboards of the F-250 and drove 15 hours straight to Reno. Harris operated out of a massive corrugated steel warehouse that smelled of ozone and sulfur. He was a quiet, intensely focused man in his 60s who didn't ask her name and didn't offer his. Maeve dropped one of the black bricks onto his stainless steel workbench. The heavy thud echoed in the cavernous room. Harris raised an eyebrow. He took a handheld grinder and buzzed away a thick patch of the black enamel. The bright yellow metal shone violently under the warehouse lights. He placed a drop of nitric acid on the exposed metal. It didn't fizz, it didn't turn green. He looked up at her, his expression entirely unreadable. "It's crude," he said, his voice like dry gravel. "Poured dirty. I'll need to melt it down, skim the slag, and recast it into serialized kilo bars. I use my own foundry stamp. It makes it clean, legitimate." "How much?" Maeve asked. "I take 15% of the total yield, paid in kind." 15%. It was highway robbery. It was over $2.5 million if she brought him the entire haul. "Fine," Maeve said, not blinking. "Do it." Over the next 8 months, Maeve made 6 trips to Nevada. She watched as Harris dropped the ugly, black-painted bricks into a roaring induction furnace. She watched the metal turn into liquid fire, burning away the impurities, the paint, the 22 years of rot and dust. She watched him pour it into graphite molds, stamping them with clean corporate serial numbers. She drove back to Portland with legitimate bullion. She hired a ruthless, high-end tax attorney in Seattle. She established a blind trust in Wyoming. She sold the serialized bars through institutional brokers, deliberately paying the capital gains taxes. She wanted a paper trail. She wanted the federal government to look at her money and see a perfectly manicured, heavily taxed wall of legality. By the time winter rolled around again, the self-storage unit was empty. Maeve's life changed, but not in the way the movies portray. She didn't buy a yacht. She didn't buy designer clothes or a penthouse in Manhattan. She bought a quiet, mid-century modern house on a cliff overlooking the Oregon coast, paid for in full by the trust. She spent her mornings drinking coffee on the deck, watching the Pacific Ocean churn in the gray light. She read books. She learned how to garden. She lived with the quiet, luxurious invisibility of true wealth. In late November, her laptop chimed with a new email. It was from William Finch, the probate lawyer. Subject: Desmond Cole Estate. Final release of claims. Maeve opened it. Dear Ms. Cole, I hope this email finds you well. I am contacting you on behalf of your cousins, Pierce and Caroline Cole. They are looking to expand their sustainable timber portfolio and have expressed interest in the 70-acre parcel of land you inherited. Given the dilapidated state of the structure and the steep grading of the land, they are willing to offer you a sum of $15,000 for the deed, assuming all liability for the demolition of the hazard on the property. Attached is a quitclaim deed. If you are agreeable, please sign and notarize it, and I will wire the funds to your account immediately. Regards, William Finch, Egg. Maeve read the email twice. She leaned back in her expensive, ergonomic chair and let out a long, slow laugh. The sound bounced off the expansive glass windows of her living room. They were still doing it, 22 years later, sitting on their millions. They were still trying to scrape the bottom of the barrel to take the last, worthless scraps from her. They wanted the trees. They wanted the dirt. Maeve downloaded the quitclaim deed. She printed it out on her laser printer. She drove down into town, walked into a local bank, and signed it in front of a notary. She didn't negotiate. She didn't ask for $20,000. She mailed the physical document back to Finch's office with a single yellow sticky note attached to the front page. Keep the foundation. Let them bulldoze the rotting wood. Let them clear the brush. Let them stand in the mud exactly where the brutalist stove used to sit, completely oblivious to the fact that the ghost they had ignored had walked away with the real empire. That afternoon, Maeve drove to the local cemetery. The rain was falling in a familiar, misty drizzle. She walked past the elaborate mausoleums and towering obelisks until she reached a flat, unassuming section of the grass. Her mother's grave was marked by a simple, flat, bronze plaque. It was the cheapest marker the funeral home offered. Maeve stood over it, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her warm wool coat. She had the money now. She could have this plaque ripped up tomorrow. She could commission a massive monument of imported Italian marble. She could build a pavilion, but she didn't. Money was a tool. It was armor against a world that viewed weakness as an invitation, but it was not a time machine. It couldn't bring her mother back to see the ocean. It couldn't unbreak the years of stress and poverty. Maeve reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against a small, heavy disc of metal. It was a single gold Krugerrand, the only piece of the hoard she hadn't melted down or sold. The last remnant of Desmond's spiteful, glorious trick. She knelt in the wet grass. She placed the gold coin carefully on the edge of the bronze plaque. A silent toll paid to the past. She stood up, turned her back on the graveyard, and walked toward her car. The engine purred to life, warm and quiet. Maeve put it in drive and headed back toward the coast, leaving the dead to their dirt, while she finally stepped into the light. If Maeve's story proves anything, it's that the best revenge isn't loud. It isn't a screaming match in a home attorney's office or a dramatic courtroom showdown. True revenge is quiet. It's letting the greedy fight over the scraps while you quietly load the foundation into the back of a beaten-up Ford. Have you ever been underestimated or forgotten by the people who were supposed to have your back? Let me know your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of quiet, ruthless karma, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a win, and subscribe for more stories where the underdog takes it all.